Welcome back to Face the Nation. We go now to the Kentucky Governor, Andy Beshear, who joins us this morning from Frankfort. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, we know that you are an advocate for Vice President Harris. And as a Democrat who runs a red state, how would you advise Democrats to stop losing support in rural areas?
Well, I'd advise them to first of all, focus on those things that matter most to people when they wake up in the morning. When people wake up in the morning, they're not thinking about this presidential election. They're thinking about their job and whether they make enough to support their family. They're thinking about their next doctor's appointment for themselves, their kids. They're thinking about the roads and bridges that they drive. They're thinking about the school they drop their kids off at, and they're thinking about the public safety in their community. That's why I'm so excited about the Vice President's new economic plan. I think it goes right to the heart of how you support your family with two tax credit extensions or expansions that will help the middle class. It goes to affording health care and capping overall pharmaceutical costs. The bipartisan infrastructure law further helps us on the roads and bridges we travel. So very excited to support the Harris-Walz team. They're going to have a big victory.
Well, to get many of those things done, the vice president would need Congress to work with her. So those aren't quick fixes necessarily. But on the Harris economic plan that you mentioned, there was also this federal ban on price gouging on food and penalties for companies that exploit crises. President Obama's top economist, Jason Furman, was critical, saying the good case scenario is price gouging is a message, not a reality. And the bad case scenario is that this is a real proposal. You'll end up with bigger shortages, less supply, ultimately risk higher prices and worse outcomes for consumers. Do you know how this would work?
I do, because I've been an attorney general just like the vice president. I pursued price gouging statutes and their violations when it comes to the price of gas in Kentucky, and we won and ultimately returned millions of dollars to our people. This isn't about trying to price fix. It's just making sure that the economy is operating the way it should, that this is really supply and demand, which we all respect. It's no different than what Teddy Roosevelt did in breaking up monopolies. It's just making sure we have the right regulations and tools in place to make sure everybody is playing the game fairly and by the rules.
So it sounds like you're just talking about antitrust policy, but which is something J.D. Vance actually supports. But Republicans, as you know, are accusing Harris of advocating for price controls, like in communist countries where the government sets a price rather than the marketplace. You just said it's not price controls, but can you explain then how you define what an excessive price is if you don't have a benchmark?
Well, first, these are types of statutes that exist in state law. The Texas Attorney General has prosecuted price gouging violations, and I don't think anyone is going to claim that he is into price fixing, and neither is the vice president. This has to be evidence-based. Ultimately, you bring an action and you have to prove it in court. So you have to have the evidence that this is beyond supply and demand, that this is people taking advantage of us. Certainly, we've seen it after natural disasters in red states and blue states. It's just making sure that coming out of the pandemic or in difficult times that people aren't increasing the price of food just to make a bigger profit. All it is making sure that capitalism stays within the guardrails, and it's not new. We've been doing this in the states for a long time.
So you also mentioned there some of the federal support for efforts already underway, including, by the way, electric vehicles, which I know Kentucky, you talked quite a lot about attracting some of these plants there, $11 billion invested in EV facilities. You've got at least 3 expected to open in 2025. What's the breakdown there of union versus non-union jobs?
Well, all of the facilities are being built with union labor, thousands upon thousands of jobs over the course of that construction, which has taken years. Now, when the Ford SK plants open, that won't be union labor because of an agreement reached between Ford and the UAW, between CEO Farley and Shawn Fain, and we respect those agreements and their negotiations. Now, what it did mean is that 10,000 plus UAW workers in Ford's 2 other facilities in Kentucky got better wages, better benefits, a better life for their families. So we're excited about how the union and the company were able to come together to reach an agreement that works for everybody, and that's what we want to see, right? We want to see companies continue to invest because we need them, but we want them to be good jobs that support our families, and I think that's the outcome we got here.
We've seen this interesting phenomenon, though, where red states, often right-to-work states like Kentucky have benefited from these federal investments and subsidies. But we don't really hear Democrats talking about that too much. Do you think that companies are opening plants in right-to-work states like yours because the labor is simply cheaper?
I have never heard an employer talk about right to work in Kentucky. In fact, we've opened a number of facilities that have union workers. We see more and more companies using the building trades, union labor, to build their facilities. In fact, union membership has gone up in Kentucky each of the last 2 years, and certainly our building trades are busier than they have ever been. This may be the golden age of union labor in Kentucky, despite having those terrible statutes on the books. But my job as governor isn't to whine or complain about the statutes we have, but to go out and to build the best lives for our people. And certainly the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the BEAD program, they require reasonable wages where employers immediately turn to labor, to organized labor, because they know they're the most skilled and the very best. And I'm now seeing better interaction between companies and organized labor than I have in decades. It's really exciting.
And I know you'll be talking about labor and its role at the convention later this week. Governor, thank you very much for your time today. We'll be right back. We go now to Austin Goolsbee, the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Before taking on that apolitical role, he had previously served in the Obama administration. Good morning to you.
Hi, great to see you again, Margaret.
So, President Goolsbee, Barron's had a piece yesterday saying that the most consequential event this fall won't be the U.S. election, it won't be a war in the Middle East, it will be the Federal Reserve's decision in September to lower interest rates for the first time in more than 4 years. Is that a certainty? Do you think it is time to lower rates?
Oh, I don't think it's a certainty, and I don't like, as you know, tying our hands ahead of time when we got a lot of data to come in and everyone on the committee is going to get to speak their piece, and it's a committee decision. We try, as the Fed, to make clear what our reaction function is, if you want to call it that. I invite everybody to go read the Statement of Economic Projections, which in our world, colloquially, we call the dot plot, where we outline every quarter what do the members of the committee individually think will be the appropriate policy for each of the next 3 years, and what economic conditions do they expect to correspond with those. And we've been making clear for quite a while what economic conditions would be appropriate for us to cut rates, for us to hold rates where they are, and things like that. And I do think that we set an interest rate more than a year ago at a high level because we were fighting inflation, and the economic conditions today are very different than they were when we set the rate at this level.
So interest rates and supply of housing impact what consumers end up paying for shelter. What is going to bring down shelter costs? Because that was such a big part of the inflation number that we just saw.
Well, look, Margaret, you know as much as anybody about this. The biggest puzzle that we've seen in the inflation numbers has been the persistently high inflation rate on shelter and housing. And we can get a little mixed up because that official measure is a very lagging indicator of what the actual housing price conditions are on the ground. So our puzzle has been why the market rents inflation rate has come down, but that hasn't yet been reflected into the official backward-looking housing inflation. So one of the things that's going to bring it down is just we're going to keep getting more data, and that's going to get incorporated into the official series. But the second is the interest rate, how it works, how the Fed stabilizes business cycle is when it tightens the screwdriver, the interest rate goes up and the demand for housing goes down. And so some of those interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, weakness in that is partly how the monetary transmission takes place and the inflation rate softens. And it's worth noting that last year, inflation fell by almost as much as it has ever fallen in a single year in the United States. And that happened without a recession, which is unparalleled. So we're hoping to continue some of that as we go through 24.
That's part of the delicate dance the Fed is doing here. Bank of America's CEO was with us last week on Face the Nation, and he told us his economists are no longer predicting a recession, but he did say there's a risk if the Fed does not start to move rates down. Take a listen.
They've told people rates probably aren't going to go up, but if they don't start taking them down relatively soon, you could dispirit the American consumer. Once the American consumer really starts going very negative, then it's hard to get them back.
He also said corporations aren't using their lines of credit due to the higher rates. What do you make of that caution?
I think it's a valid caution. When rates are this high, if you take a measure of how tight the Fed is as just what's the rate minus what's the inflation rate, when you set a rate high like we have and hold it there while inflation falls, you're actually tightening. Credit conditions are getting tighter. And when we go out in the Chicago 7th District, you can hear from business leaders and community leaders around the district that credit conditions on them are tight. When you bank loans and what the rates they pay and credit availability is tight. So I think he's right. I think you got to have a caution when you see small business defaults rising like they have been rising, when you see consumer credit delinquencies, credit card delinquencies rising like they've been rising. Those are warning signs. Now, there's some others that are more positive, but they're definitely of concern. And if you keep too tight for too long, you will have a problem on the employment side of the Fed's mandate.
So a recession for you, is it off the table?
No, look, you've seen the table at the FOMC meetings, a huge table.
I know.
Everything is always on the table. There's possibility of recession. The last GDP growth number was higher than expected, so that was one of the bright spots. But you always got to worry about every contingency. That's the job of the central banker.
I want to ask you as well about what's happening with what people pay at the grocery store. The San Francisco Fed found that corporate markups, what some might call price gouging, are not a primary contributor to inflation. Do your economists agree?
Well, look, this has turned into a campaign election kind of battleground. So Fed is not political. We're not in elections business. I'm not going to get into that. I think that it's worth remembering that there are dynamics at play. That is, over time, wages tend to move slower than prices. So if some shock hits, prices go up, then wages go up. Then prices come down, then wages come down. And so if you look at any given moment, that markup, sort of the difference between what's happening to prices and what's happening to costs, that can vary a lot over the business cycle. So I just caution everybody over concluding from any one observation about markups.
Are tariffs inflationary?
It sounds funny to say it depends what you mean by inflationary. Tariffs raise prices, but in terms of something that inflationary is about the rate of growth of prices, a one-time increase in costs will raise prices, but is not an extended inflationary thing. So whether you want to call that inflationary or not, they raise costs and they raise prices.
Austin Goolsbee, we want your perspective as one of the top economists in the country. I know you left politics behind, and I've made you a little uncomfortable by asking you some of these questions, but we want to bottom line it.
You're the smartest in the business, Margaret, and any time you want to talk Fed mandate, inflation or employment, I'm always up for it.
All right, Austin Goolsbee, thank you for your time. We'll be back in a moment. Fentanyl and other so-called synthetic opioids are the main driver behind overdose deaths in the United States, according to the CDC. But in light of the recent death of actor Matthew Perry from an overdose of ketamine, a controlled substance that can be used in clinical and therapeutic settings, there are growing concerns over the abuse of that drug as well. Joining us now to discuss it all is the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, Ann Milgram. She's in New York this morning. Welcome back, Administrator.
Thank you for having me.
So you just had these arrests this week. As we outlined, ketamine is an anesthetic, but it can be used to treat depression in times. When you announced these charges, you said this was a case of where substance abuse began in a doctor's office and then it ended up in the street. How common is the abuse of ketamine now?
That's right, Margaret. So in the case of Matthew Perry's death, we announced charges against the 5 individuals who we believe are responsible for that. And again, what happened there is it started with 2 unscrupulous doctors who were violating their oath, which is to take care of their patients, and instead supplying Matthew Perry with enormous quantities of ketamine in exchange for huge amounts of money. And then it switched to the street where Matthew Perry was buying the ketamine from 2 drug traffickers on the streets of Los Angeles. And so this, unfortunately, is a tragic arc that we have seen, thinking back to the beginning of the opioid epidemic, where many Americans became addicted to controlled substances in doctors' offices and through medical practitioners that then turned into street addiction as well.
Well, exactly to that point, it sounds a bit like the beginning of the opioid crisis when we were talking about pill mills. Now you are seeing ketamine clinics pop up and claim to be treatment for depression and other things. Do they need to be more regulated? How do you get your arms around this?
So one of the things that's important to recognize, so ketamine is a controlled substance, and it has a high potential, obviously, for addiction and other challenges. The FDA regulates the medical prescribing of ketamine, and so they have approved it as an anesthesia. They have approved it through a nasal spray for the treatment of depression, and so they regulate the medical side of this. At DEA, what we're focused on doctors, nurse practitioners, anyone who is essentially diverting legitimate controlled substances from the normal medical practice to do what we saw happening here, where these doctors were not evaluating Matthew Perry. They were not supervising injections. They were leaving behind vials of ketamine for Matthew Perry to be injected by his assistant. And so, again, we're focused on the controlled substance side, but we every single day are targeting and investigating doctors, nurse practitioners, others who are violating this duty of trust to their patients by over-prescribing medicine or prescribing medicine that isn't necessary. And here, again, what we've alleged is that these doctors were seeking a huge payout from Matthew Perry. They charged him around $50,000 over the course of 1 month to supply ketamine.
Fentanyl is also used in medical settings, but it also happens to be the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45, according to the DEA. That is a stunning statistic. We have heard a lot about this on the campaign trail. We have heard President Biden talk about sanctioning, Chinese entities, about charges against Mexican cartels doing business with Chinese groups, and yet we are still hearing about a high degree of overdoses due to fentanyl. Why is it so hard to crack down on?
So, Margaret, you're right in pointing this out, that in 2018, In 22, we lost 107,941 American lives to fentanyl and methamphetamine. And this is a tragic situation we're facing, where fentanyl is widespread in every single community across the United States, from coast to coast and everywhere in between. And what we are seeing is that the cost of manufacturing fentanyl for the two cartels in Mexico that are responsible, the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, is pennies. And so this is the cheapest drug we have ever faced, and the only limit on the amount of drugs that can be made are the chemicals that are being sourced by the cartels from China, and essentially the production, which again costs pennies for these two cartels to make. So we are fighting what I would argue is the greatest threat in narcotics that we've ever faced, and at DEA we're focused on saving American lives. One of the core ways we're doing that is working across their entire network. Both of those cartels are operating in more than 50 countries around the globe, and we're targeting every part of that global supply chain, from the Chinese chemical companies and Chinese nationals, who we charged last year and this year, to the Mexican cartel leaders, manufacturers, to the people that are selling drugs in the United States on behalf of the cartels, and then the money launderers who are working for the cartels. In 2023, we took action across that entire network.
Yeah.
We'll do the same in 2024. And so we have a strategic plan. We're working to take apart these networks, and we're starting to see progress. But there is a lot more work to be done, because how addictive fentanyl is, how tiny quantities can kill someone. And for the first time, the cartels are hiding fentanyl in other drugs. They're making them look like real prescription medicines, which are all fentanyl and filler. And so this is just a dramatically changed landscape that we've now pivoted to address and take head on. And every day we're fighting to save lives by defeating those two cartels and stopping fentanyl.
Well, Mexico's president has said he won't fight the Mexican drug cartels. His slogan is hugs, not bullets. The new incoming president, who gets sworn in October 1st, has said she'll follow the policies of her predecessor. That's going to be a big problem for your enforcement, isn't it?
So we have to work across the globe to stop this threat, to stop Americans from dying. And so again, we're focused on, we've made a number of criminal charges in China. We've also begun since last November, when President Biden met with President Xi, we've started to have engagements again. We've re-engaged with the Chinese Ministry of Public Security. Recently, we took down a case in Los Angeles where we connected. We basically showed that a Chinese money laundering organization was working directly with the Sinaloa cartel. In China, they made one arrest, and in Mexico, they made one arrest.
Okay.
It's that kind of work together that will help us to have an impact and to stop this threat.
Administrator Milgram, will track your progress. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.